May 18, 1985. A plane from London lands at Moscow airport. One of the passengers is a high-ranking officer of the KGB. His name is Oleg Gordievsky. A colonel of state security, he headed the KGB residency in London. An extremely successful career for a relatively young man. Gordievsky is only 46 years old. For the last 12 years, he has been the most valuable spy for the British Secret Service. This visit to Moscow is truly dangerous for Gordievsky. The day before, he was urgently summoned from London for a meeting with his superiors, formally to discuss work in his new position. In reality, this might just be a pretext. If the KGB somehow learned about Gordievsky's ties with the British Secret Service, it would be the end not only of his career but of his life. At Sheremetyevo Airport, the KGB colonel is not met by anyone. Extremely strange. Considering his high position, the management should have sent a car with a driver. Gordievsky is nervous. The only thought that calms him is that if the KGB wanted to arrest the traitor, they would have done so immediately upon exiting the plane. The colonel gets into a taxi and heads to his apartment on Leninsky Prospect. The British spy does not yet know that 2 hours earlier, officers from the KGB counterintelligence department had visited there. They carefully searched the apartment, installed listening devices behind the wallpaper and baseboards, placed microphones on the phone and cameras in the lamps. Finally, they treated Gordievsky's clothes and shoes with special radioactive dust. The concentration is not dangerous to health, but allows tracking a person's movements with a Geiger counter. Gordievsky ascends to the 8th floor of the building, opens 2 locks, but the door does not give way. The 3rd lock, which was installed during the construction of the building, is closed. In all his time living in this apartment, Gordievsky has never used it. He doesn't even have a key for it. This means only one thing. His KGB colleagues had previously broken in, searched the apartment, installed surveillance, and upon leaving locked all the locks. Gordievsky realizes that he is being watched and suspected of espionage. The KGB knows how to extract information from people, so the chances that the colonel will be lucky and return to London as if nothing happened are minimal. The only possible punishment for a Soviet special service employee caught working for a foreign intelligence agency is the death penalty. Oleg Gordievsky knows this perfectly well. The 20th century offered many astonishing stories related to the work of secret services of different countries, but if trying to choose the most incredible story, it is the story of Oleg Gordievsky. For the KGB, it is one of the major failures for the British Secret Service, the most successful operation against the Soviet Union. This story has unpredictable turns and an incredible finale, complex heroes and decisions that depend not only on their life, but the life of all humanity. The Committee of State Security is a legendary organization. The assessments of its activities differ so greatly that an entire universe could fit between the opposing opinions. However, what neither the supporters nor the detractors of the KGB would deny is its influence on the life of the country and the world. Partially, the image of the ubiquitous Committee for State Security is connected to the structure of the organization. The KGB was involved in counterintelligence, foreign intelligence, operational and investigative activities, border security, and crime fighting. And this is far from the whole list. In many Western countries, each of these functions was performed by a separate agency. In the Soviet Union, there was one all-powerful Committee for State Security. At the peak of the organization's existence, more than 1 million people worked there, officers, agents, and informers. Yet, the KGB was truly an exclusive club. Typically, you did not choose this job, it chose you. For most, a career in the KGB began during student years or shortly thereafter, when they were recruited by the organization's employees. To some extent, Oleg Gordievsky was born to work for the KGB. His father, Anton, was a devoted communist and an employee initially of the NKVD and later the KGB. The apogee of Gordievsky Sr.'s career occurred at the end of the 1930s. The mass repressions and other controversial chapters of the Soviet State Security Service's history did not shake the officer's faith. Anton Gordievsky always repeated that the NKVD did not make mistakes. In the year 1938, his son Oleg was born. He became the second child. 6 years earlier, the family had their first son, Vasily. The seeds of the future British spy Oleg Gordievsky might be seen in his mother, who did not share her husband's view of the NKVD's infallibility, or in his grandmother, who secretly baptized older brother Vasily away from his father. But likely the shift in values occurred later. In the 1950s, after graduating from school, Oleg was a typical product of the Soviet system, an active comrade in the Komsomol, a sportsman and an excellent student with a silver medal. He entered one of the country's best higher education institutions, MGIMO. The institute was a forge of diplomats, scholars, statespersons and spies. The advanced foreign language programs at MGIMO served as a direct path to work in foreign KGB residencies. Precisely what Oleg Gordievsky wanted. The spies of the Soviet Committee for State Security Abroad were divided into two types, legal and illegal. The former included officers who went to work abroad under the guise of official diplomatic duties. Thus, part of the time they could be consular staff, accredited journalists, but primarily they performed tasks for the KGB. The so-called illegals did not have any official status. Typically, they were sent to the country under false names with forged documents. Just like legal spies, they recruited agents, informants, obtained secret data, or could remain in the country's territory as so-called sleepers, agents living ordinary civilian lives who could be activated in the event of war or serious conflict. Vasily Gordievsky was indeed one of the illegals. He began his career in the KGB while his younger brother was still a student. It was Vasily who hinted to his boss that his brother Oleg was successful in foreign languages and interested in working for state security. After an interview at Lubyanka, the younger Gordievsky was offered a 6-month internship with the KGB. Oleg went to work undercover as a translator at the embassy in East Berlin. His first assignment was a meeting with a woman, a former KGB informant. Gordievsky was merely required to establish contact and confirm the informant's willingness to continue cooperation. According to Oleg, it was a short and boring conversation. Only after some time did he realize that the meeting was a test, but not for the informant, for him. Several decades later, Gordievsky would recall that serious cracks in his Soviet worldview began to appear back in college. However, even if this was true, it was only partially so. He was aware of the Hungarian uprising in the 50s, which was suppressed by Soviet tanks, and he had personally seen the construction of the Berlin Wall. His student years coincided with the thaw and the denunciation of Stalin's cult. Nevertheless, after returning from the internship in Germany, Oleg Gordievsky decided to become a full-fledged KGB officer. One of the main reasons for this decision was that working in the State Security Committee was not just prestigious, but also promised work abroad. This was Gordievsky's goal. After all, he was barely in his 20s. He simply wanted to see the world. He simply wanted adventure. Future KGB spies underwent special training. They were taught the craft of espionage and counter-espionage, recruitment and agent handling, use of weapons, hand-to-hand combat, how to detect surveillance, how to evade surveillance, how to organize surveillance, how to leave or retrieve a drop, how to do all this and much more without revealing that they were Soviet spies. Such skills were essential for the effective work of KGB officers abroad. Their duties, besides the usual intelligence work, could also include not entirely ethical operations such as disinformation, political manipulation, kidnapping, and assassinations. All recruits who successfully completed training took an oath in which they swore to faithfully serve their homeland to the last drop of blood. Oleg Gordievsky did the same. In the summer of 1963, he took his first full-fledged position within the ranks of state security. To Oleg's great disappointment, he did not receive the desired assignment in one of the Western countries. Instead, he was left in Moscow. In a modest office at Lubyanka, he performed routine paperwork for the KGB department dealing with the work of illegals. The position did not entail exciting adventures or trips abroad. Gordievsky understood that one of the main limiting factors was his unmarried status. The KGB did not send unmarried employees to work abroad. The logic was that a married person was far less likely to defect, since his wife and children would remain in the hands of the KGB. They met at a gathering of mutual acquaintances. Elena Akopian seemed the perfect candidate for the role of a wife, a German teacher who also dreamed of a life abroad. Although their quick marriage could not be called a complete calculation, romance was not exactly the primary factor there. After marriage, the chances of both being sent abroad increased dramatically. For Oleg, this removed the main obstacle to his assignment. For Elena, her husband became her ticket outside the USSR. After more than 2 years of paperwork at Lubyanka, he was offered a vacant position at the KGB residency in Denmark. If in the mid-60s it was necessary to choose one city to demonstrate to a Soviet person all the advantages of Western capitalist society, it was likely Copenhagen, a relatively small, clean, beautiful, and affluent European capital, very close to Andersen's fairy tales, very far from Soviet reality. Officially, Oleg received a position as a consular clerk. In reality, he was responsible for managing illegal operations in Denmark. This meant that before noon, Gordievsky dealt with visa work, and after noon espionage began. He dropped off and picked up dead drops with information for existing agents, handed them money, monitored their work, and reported back to his superiors. It sounds like a typical spy job from the movies. In part, it was exactly that. The resourceful signals left by illegals for their handlers are worth noting. For example, an orange peel under a particular bench meant "I am in danger," while an apple core left in the same place conveyed that the agent was leaving the country the next day. This unofficial activity had to be conducted covertly. The Danish intelligence services were well aware that some employees of the Soviet embassy were KGB officers, so they were under partial surveillance. Evading observation was aided by intercepting radio communications of Danish agents. This task was handled by Gordievsky's wife Elena. She also got a position at the KGB thanks to her knowledge of foreign languages. At the same time, there was another aspect to the work of the KGB residency in Denmark, something unlikely to become the plot of a thrilling spy film. It involved corruption among Soviet officers. Substantial funds were allocated to the recruitment of informants and agents, as well as for working with them. People ready to hand over important information to the USSR needed to be entertained in restaurants, given desired gifts, and provided with other bonuses. Instead, many KGB employees created the illusion of bustling activity, wrote fabricated reports, and pocketed the money themselves. Gordievsky wanted to stand out in this context. He wanted to demonstrate his effectiveness to his superiors. He was already fluent in German and Swedish, and upon his appointment to Copenhagen, he immediately began learning Danish. Among his colleagues at the new workplace, only a few knew this language. Most importantly, Gordievsky was actively fulfilling his direct duties of managing illegal operatives in the country and striving to recruit new valuable agents. The head of political intelligence in Copenhagen, Mikhail Lyubimov, noted the diligence and conscientiousness of the new residency staff member. One of the main reasons Gordievsky tried to impress his superiors was his keen desire to continue working abroad. He liked Denmark, Copenhagen, and Western life, the variety of goods, music, and books unavailable to Soviet citizens, and other kinds of freedom. Once, Gordievsky wandered into Copenhagen's red light district. There he discovered adult products, magazines, and gay magazines. Having never seen anything like this before, the Soviet officer began to examine the images with great interest. At that moment, he was being watched by Danish intelligence services, and they suspected Gordievsky of homosexuality. This was a good reason for blackmail and subsequent recruitment. Gradually, the Danes began to develop a case on Oleg Gordievsky. In their documents, he went by the codename Uncle Kermson. After a couple of years of living in Copenhagen, significant changes began to occur in the worldview of the young KGB residency officer. Gordievsky's marriage was gradually falling apart. Despite Oleg's attraction to freedom and Western values, his views on family and the role of women were quite conservative. His wife Elena, on the contrary, could be described as a feminist of her time. She clearly did not see herself in the role of a dutiful housekeeper. Ultimately, Elena revealed that even before their departure from Moscow, she had secretly had an abortion. At the same time, major political changes began occurring in Eastern Europe. This refers to the democratic reforms in Czechoslovakia in the year 1968, which went down in history as the Prague Spring. Gordievsky closely followed the events and empathized with the reformers. At the time, he did not know that his older brother Vasily was in Czechoslovakia as an illegal operative. He was one of those agents the KGB sent to thwart plans for liberalization. Vasily was involved in disinformation, pressure, and kidnapping. The Prague Spring ended in August 1968 when troops from the USSR and other Warsaw Pact countries entered the country. Gordievsky was devastated. One of the reasons Oleg felt deeply for what was happening was his closest university friend, Stanislav Kaplan. After studying in Moscow, Kaplan returned to Czechoslovakia and worked in intelligence. But during the Prague Spring events, he sided with the reformers. Gradually, problems also began to arise in Gordievsky's professional life. Danish intelligence was increasingly keeping a close watch on him. They also attempted to play the homosexuality card by sending a colleague agent to seduce him. The move failed. Firstly, Gordievsky was sufficiently cautious and quickly severed contact, and secondly, he simply was not gay. Nevertheless, the KGB recorded intelligence activity concerning Gordievsky as a sign. The Danes likely realized that he was not an ordinary consulate employee. His superiors halted all of Gordievsky's illegal activities and informed him that he was expected to transfer to Moscow in a few months. This was a tough homecoming. After 3 years of living in the Western capitalist Copenhagen, Oleg Gordievsky found himself back in socialist Moscow. In his eyes, the contrast was enormous and not in favor of his home country. Oleg resumed his position in the same department where he had worked before his assignment in Denmark. The new post was a slight promotion, but for Gordievsky, it was not cause for joy. He wanted another foreign assignment. It is unknown when Oleg would have been given such a chance, or if at all, if not for 2 events. The first was a significant KGB failure. The second was the sudden death of his brother Vasily. In 1971, the largest expulsion of KGB employees in British history took place. The British declared over 100 individuals persona non grata, suspecting them of working for Soviet intelligence. The trigger was the defection of KGB employee in Britain, Oleg Lialin, who exposed most of his colleagues. Since the Danish Secret Services actively cooperated with the British, the expulsion also affected 3 KGB officers in Copenhagen, working undercover as diplomats. Thus, a vacancy for the head of political intelligence in Denmark opened up. However, the superiors were reluctant to release Gordievsky. Their decision changed after the sudden death of his brother Vasily, who worked in the same KGB department. The elder Gordievsky spent almost his entire career as an illegal agent in various countries. In the process, he developed serious alcohol problems, leading to his death at 39. Following this, the administration decided to let Gordievsky go. The only obstacle could be obtaining a visa. The Danes could simply refuse entry to any diplomatic mission member if they suspected he was an undercover intelligence officer. Given that Gordievsky was actively monitored during his first assignment, it is logical to assume that certain suspicions existed on the Danish side. Nevertheless, Gordievsky's visa was approved. Either suspicions were inadequate or the reason lay elsewhere. Immediately after the collapse of the Prague Spring in 1968, intelligence officer Stanislav Kaplan decided to flee. He went on vacation to Bulgaria and disappeared there. Sometime later, Kaplan resurfaced in France, where he surrendered to Canadian authorities. Canadian intelligence services had close relations with British intelligence services, and their officers interrogated a defector. He revealed the names of about 100 individuals who might be of interest to Western intelligence. The overwhelming majority of people on this list were Czechs, with only a few being representatives of the USSR. One of them was Oleg Gordievsky. Kaplan knew his best friend well from university. They both adored running, courted girls together, and loved talking about freedom. According to Kaplan, Gordievsky might agree to cooperate with Western intelligence services. Thus, the British Foreign Intelligence Service began developing a potential agent under the codename Sunbeam. Behind the pseudonym was Oleg Gordievsky. Considering the close cooperation between Danish and British intelligence services, the approval of a new diplomatic visa for Gordievsky seems quite logical. It might have been connected to the intelligence service's desire to recruit a valuable agent. At the end of the year 1972, the Gordievskys returned to Copenhagen. This time, Oleg's position was higher. Officially, he was the second secretary at the Soviet embassy, unofficially the head of political intelligence at the KGB residence in Denmark. His duties no longer included handling illegal operatives, and the new job was more sophisticated. Political intelligence sought potential informants and agents among Danish politicians, public figures, journalists, diplomats, and others whose information might be of interest to the Soviet Union. Political intelligence was also responsible for information influence, disinformation and propaganda meant to portray a positive image of the USSR and a negative image of the West. However, the Danish KGB residency could only boast modest results. The reason was not only the laziness and corruption of some residency officers, but also the mentality of the Danes. The locals were not very willing to cooperate with the KGB. Even representatives of the Danish Communist Party were not ready for outright betrayal. Despite this, Gordievsky continued active work and demonstrated his zeal and diligence to his superiors. For this, he received the rank of major. In professional terms, Oleg Gordievsky could consider his career successful. In his mid-30s, he held a high rank and an overseas position. At this rate, by 40, he could lead a residency in one of the Western countries. Nonetheless, the few years spent in Moscow between assignments in Copenhagen severely undermined the officer's loyalty to the Soviet system. He began to see it as corrupt and hypocritical. In Denmark, Gordievsky started reading Solzhenitsyn and other authors banned in the USSR. He received news of his university friend Kaplan's escape to the West. In short, internally, Gordievsky was close to beginning to work for Western intelligence. He did not yet know that Western intelligence was already fully prepared to work with him. Recruiting an agent is a complex art of seduction. On one hand, the initiator needs to show sufficient interest, but on the other hand, too much pressure will only repel the potential contact. The British Secret Service managed to meet Gordievsky in person. The head of the MI6 Danish residency frequently encountered the potential agent at receptions for diplomatic workers from various countries. Gordievsky, a great admirer of art and classical music, was always eager to discuss these topics with Western diplomats, including the British. However, to initiate direct contact with Gordievsky, MI6 decided to involve an outsider, someone whom Oleg knew very well. Stanislav Kaplan got in touch with Gordievsky and said he was passing through Copenhagen and suggested that old friends should meet. Oleg agreed. At the meeting, he was extremely cautious. Gordievsky understood that the unexpected reappearance of a university friend in his life was not coincidental, but he did not know exactly who had sent Kaplan or why. Spies from various countries actively used a method called the bait. The goal was to gain the target's trust by promising to provide what they needed and then expose them. For example, the KGB might send one of their operatives to an international diplomat whom they suspected of intelligence work. The KGB operative would play the role of a disillusioned officer ready to leak state secrets to Western intelligence services. As soon as the exchange of information began, there would be a session of exposure. The Western diplomat would be accused of espionage and expelled from the country. The Danes or the British might have tried the same tactic with Gordievsky. That is why he told Kaplan nothing incriminating during the meeting, although he hinted at the end that he would not report their encounter to his superiors. It was akin to saying to a potential mistress, "My wife doesn't know I'm here." In other words, his intentions were clearly indicated. During the next few meetings with Gordievsky, the head of the MI6 Danish residency was already present. Initially, He subtly hinted that the British were aware that Gordievsky was not a diplomat but a KGB officer. Oleg continued to behave cautiously, giving evasive answers, confirming nothing but denying nothing either. Finally, the MI6 representative decided to take a bold step. He directly asked Gordievsky if he was willing to cooperate. Oleg dodged the question. The Briton continued to press. "Who heads the political intelligence of the KGB in the Danish residency?" he asked. "I do," Gordievsky unexpectedly replied. At that moment he crossed the line. A KGB officer who had taken an oath agreed to cooperate with the intelligence service of another country. In other words, Gordievsky committed treason. Images from the past flashed through his mind. His father, who had hidden the unpleasant truth about his job all his life. His mother, who did not believe in the infallibility of the NKVD. The Hungarian uprising, the construction of the Berlin Wall, the escape of his best friend, his love for Western culture, his growing disgust with the Soviet regime, and his belief that his homeland could change. All of this made the act of betrayal justifiable, at least in his mind. Following the official start of cooperation with MI6, Gordievsky's meetings with his handlers began to take place once a month in a safe house on the outskirts of Copenhagen. The details of MI6's new operation within the KGB were kept highly confidential. British intelligence had never before worked with an agent who was so deeply integrated into Soviet state security. Only a very narrow circle of people in British intelligence was aware of the operation codenamed Sunbeam. Only a few knew the agent's real name. Meanwhile, the Danish intelligence services continued to periodically monitor Gordievsky, suspecting this employee of the Soviet embassy of working for the KGB. The potential spy's monthly visits to the apartment on the outskirts of Copenhagen could attract the attention of agents, and their reports or messages could jeopardize the entire operation. Within the Danish Secret Service, only a few people in leadership knew about the new valuable MI6 agent. In the end, it was decided to lift surveillance on Gordievsky the days he visited the safe house. At first, the British carefully vetted the new agent. They asked many questions to which they already knew the precise answers. Gordievsky's information not only matched, but he provided much more. Details of the internal workings of KGB structures, names, appointments, operational details, agent training techniques, and even personal relationship details among different employees. Tapes of conversations were sent to Britain through diplomats. According to international agreements, diplomats' suitcases were not inspected at the border. This made it possible to secretly deliver data from the new agent directly to MI6 leadership. Over time, the British became convinced that Gordievsky was not part of a cunning KGB plan. He could be trusted, his information was reliable, and he was ready to provide much more. Oleg Gordievsky's life quickly began to resemble a game of chess. On one hand, he needed to demonstrate success to the KGB leadership to receive promotions, to gain access to more valuable information, which he would eventually pass on to MI6. On the other hand, Gordievsky could not be too successful in his activities as a spy, so as not to harm the security of Denmark or other Western countries. At the same time, it was imperative that the KGB did not learn of his betrayal. All contacts with MI6 had to be extremely careful and limited. It should also be remembered that Gordievsky lived in the same apartment with a current KGB officer. This refers to his wife, Elena, whose marriage had long since turned into a professional necessity. If his wife had had suspicions about Gordievsky, she, as a KGB officer, would have been obliged to report to her superiors. For a state security officer caught in treason in the USSR, there was only one outcome: the death penalty. In this already complicated life situation, Oleg Gordievsky fell in love. Leila Alieva worked as a typist at the World Health Organization in Copenhagen. She was younger than Gordievsky. He seemed to her experienced and interesting, knowledgeable about music and literature. Leila immediately understood that Oleg was not just an embassy staff member, but also worked for the KGB. Her father was a state security general in Azerbaijan, so she grew up among KGB representatives. What Leila did not know, however, was that her lover simultaneously worked for British intelligence. MI6 wanted to increase the intensity of data from the agent. Oleg had an excellent memory and could recount many details, but full copies of KGB documents were, of course, a priority. The British offered Gordievsky a mini camera so he could photograph papers right at his workplace. Oleg refused this idea because a single casual glance from a colleague or the discovery of British espionage equipment would put an end to his career and life. It was then decided that Gordievsky would carry documents out during his lunch break. At that time, documents from Moscow were sent to the Danish embassy on microfilm. MI6 instructed their technical department to create a small portable device for quickly copying the film. Thus, Gordievsky took materials out of the embassy during lunch and handed them to an MI6 officer, who quickly copied them within half an hour and returned them to Oleg. This had to be done with the utmost care, as any damage to the film could expose the Soviet agent. Gordievsky knew the names of many agents working for the KGB, not only in Denmark, but also in other Western countries. For MI6, the temptation was great to immediately use this information for mass arrests or expulsion of spies. However, the British decided not to rush. They understood that this would instantly arouse suspicion in the KGB. The source would be quickly discovered, and the operation would end without realizing a fraction of its potential. MI6 chose to play the long game. The longer Gordievsky remained unsuspected, the higher he could rise in the KGB's career ladder. The British began to act cautiously. For example, Agent Sunbeam reported on several high-ranking government officials in Norway and Sweden who worked for the KGB. MI6 decided that if several Soviet spies were exposed outside of Denmark, it should not raise suspicions about the residency in Copenhagen or Gordievsky himself. One of the exposed spies was an elderly employee of the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as well as a Soviet agent with 30 years of service. Throughout her long espionage career, she met with her KGB handlers hundreds of times and passed on numerous pieces of secret information. After the unexpected exposure of several spies, the KGB, of course, considered the version of a traitor in a high position. Gordievsky knew about this. For several weeks he waited to be uncovered, but it did not happen. Gradually, Agent Sunbeam agreed to receive financial rewards from MI6. Although for many people working for foreign intelligence, money was the main factor, this was not Gordievsky's case. Initially, he even stipulated that he would not receive financial compensation from the British, as his motives were ideological. Later, most of his money went to his British account, and Gordievsky fully understood that he might never be able to use it. He continued to hide an extramarital affair from his wife and colleagues, continued to use even his close friends in the KGB residency for obtaining valuable information, and continued to secretly smuggle out important documents during lunch breaks. He lied to everyone, and at the same time, according to his admission, Gordievsky felt like a truly honest person for the first time, a fighter against the totalitarian system. In the year 1978, Gordievsky was informed that he was to be transferred to Moscow. Employee rotation was normal internal practice of the State Security Committee. Considering the approaching 40th anniversary, it was assumed that Gordievsky would return to his homeland with a promotion. However, family circumstances hindered this. The management learned about his impending divorce, which already severely damaged the employee's reputation. But what was even worse were the revealed facts of infidelity during his stay in Denmark. Thus, Gordievsky was returned to Moscow to handle paperwork with a demotion. Moreover, due to the divorce, he might never be sent abroad again. Even before leaving Denmark, he asked MI6 to prepare a plan for his extraction from the Soviet Union. Such a mission in the language of intelligence services was called extraction. However, carrying out such an operation was almost impossible, and British intelligence had never had such experience before. If MI6 needed to extract Gordievsky during his service in one of the Western countries, it would not pose a significant problem. But from the Soviet Union, it was an entirely different matter. Various options were considered, and in the end, it was decided to extract Gordievsky through the Finnish border in the trunk of a British diplomatic car. Cars belonging to diplomatic staff were not searched at the border, but this was not a law, more of an unspoken rule. Thus, Soviet border guards could quite possibly ask to open the trunk. But this was only part of the problem. First, Gordievsky had to be delivered unobserved to the border under the conditions of KGB surveillance over British embassy staff. According to the plan, codenamed Pimlico, Agent Gordievsky was supposed to activate the operation with a signal. On any given Tuesday at 7:30 in the evening, he was supposed to stand by a specific bakery on Kutuzovsky Avenue with a shopping bag from a British supermarket marked with a large letter S. Every Tuesday at 7:30, a British embassy employee would walk past the designated spot under the pretense of going to the bakery, holding a chocolate bar. If he saw Gordievsky, the complex operation to extract the spy abroad would commence. The encrypted details of the plan were passed to Gordievsky in a volume of Shakespeare. He took this book with him to Moscow. If necessary, he could dampen the pages to reveal all the operation details. Despite all this intricate planning, the chances of the plan failing were enormous. Any of the numerous details could easily go awry. But this was the best that MI6 could offer their most valuable agent in the USSR. For the next 3 years, Gordievsky and MI6 did not contact each other once. The British were playing the long game. They understood that collaboration with Oleg on Soviet soil could be effective but short-lived. Most likely, his KGB colleagues would quickly uncover him. But if they waited for the agent's new overseas assignment, the payoff would be much larger. Gordievsky was ready to restart his career. He divorced, married Leila Alieva, and had 2 little daughters. All of this negatively impacted his career, but he understood that he could regain lost ground over time. In addition to his main work, Oleg began learning English. He completed the 4-year KGB course in half the time. In the year 1981, a vacancy for the Deputy Head of Political Intelligence became available at the KGB residency in London. Gordievsky realized that this was his chance. He subtly hinted to his superiors that he wanted this position. Yet, he was not the first choice. The British denied visas to several candidates for the position of consul due to suspicions of working for the KGB. When they received a request to approve a visa for Oleg Gordievsky, MI6 could not believe their own luck. Firstly, this meant their agent was safe, as they had no news from him for 3 years. Secondly, the level and amount of secret information Gordievsky would be able to relay in London would be even higher than in Copenhagen. The British, of course, approved the diplomatic visa for the new employee of the Soviet embassy. Oleg Gordievsky, along with his family, went to London. His first impression of the British capital was one of disappointment. Gordievsky found the city noisier, dirtier, and not as beautiful as Copenhagen. His new superiors also received the Deputy Head of Political Intelligence without much enthusiasm. General Arkady Guk was officially the first secretary of the embassy. In reality, he headed the British residency of the Committee for State Security. Gordievsky considered his new boss an arrogant, poorly educated, not very intelligent man who had a great fondness for drink. Arkady Guk was absolutely convinced that the British intelligence services kept constant surveillance on Soviet embassy staff, employing phone taps, installing espionage equipment in typewriters, and using other surveillance methods. Consequently, an atmosphere of paranoia permeated the London residency, and every new member was met with a degree of suspicion. In this environment, Gordievsky was tasked with establishing contact with his MI6 handlers. He dialed the number given to him years ago in Copenhagen. Gordievsky's first meeting with MI6 resembled an action scene from a spy thriller. During his lunch break, Oleg entered an inconspicuous hotel. Waiting in the lobby were his familiar contacts from the British intelligence service. Without a word, they moved to the rear exit. Gordievsky cautiously followed them at a distance. In the parking lot, they silently entered a car and began to drive. Only then did the handlers and the agent exchange their first words. They arrived at a safe house, positioned neither too close nor too far from the Soviet embassy building, so as not to risk accidentally encountering any Soviet diplomats, yet close enough to meet during lunch breaks. Thus began a new phase of Gordievsky's work for MI6. While in Moscow, he spent considerable time studying secret KGB documents. His colleagues assumed this was Oleg's way of demonstrating diligence to superiors to secure promotion. But that was only part of the reason. Gordievsky also strove to memorize as many details as possible to later report to MI6. Primarily, he focused on the spies and agents the KGB had used, was currently using, or planned to use to gather information in the West. Gordievsky's information was of immense value to the British. Never before had they had such comprehensive data on the current state and operation of the powerful KGB. A certain relief in MI6 came from Gordievsky's reports that the overall state of the chief Soviet intelligence agency was far less impressive than it had been several decades ago. At that time, KGB agents had included high-ranking British intelligence officers, well-known politicians, and public figures. By the early 1980s, things were noticeably more modest. Additionally, a large number of employees in the Committee for State Security now regarded their service merely as a means of profit. According to Gordievsky, one of the primary assets of the KGB in Britain was the head of the left-wing Labour Party, Michael Foot. In 1983, the United Kingdom was scheduled to hold its next parliamentary elections, and the Labour Party was favoured to win. Should victory be achieved, Michael Foot could become Prime Minister. According to Gordievsky, he had seen documents in the committee's archives in Moscow which indicated that Michael Foot had received money from Soviet intelligence services. While he did not provide any secret information, he was more of an agent of influence for the USSR than a spy. Michael Foot spent the money on maintaining a socialist magazine. According to Gordievsky, after the Prague Spring, the politician completely ceased contact with the KGB. Technically, Michael Foot did not break the law, but this information was sufficient to forever bury his political career. It remains unclear why the data was not made public immediately. Nonetheless, a year later, Michael Foot lost the election to Margaret Thatcher and did not become the new Prime Minister. His connections to the KGB remain a topic of debate in the United Kingdom. The first few years following Gordievsky's appointment in London became the most productive period in his work history for MI6. He provided the British with numerous secret data that helped expose Soviet spies in various Western countries. However, his cooperation's main achievement is considered the prevention of nuclear war. The early 1980s, according to many historians, was a time when the world was closest to an apocalypse, for the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis 20 years earlier. The Soviet leader Yuri Andropov was convinced that Western countries were seriously preparing for an attack on the USSR with nuclear weapons. Therefore, all KGB residencies abroad were instructed to seek any confirmation of the impending attack. According to Gordievsky, many colleagues in the London residency perceived this as an expression of Andropov's paranoia. Nonetheless, for MI6, the agent's data on the real sentiments within the Soviet leadership were extremely important. Neither Britain nor the USA wanted to provoke a conflict that would ultimately end in an apocalypse, and they made adjustments to their military plans. Thus, it is believed that the data provided by Gordievsky to the West helped avoid nuclear war. Gordievsky's materials were of immense value and often landed on the desk of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. She knew about the existence of a high-ranking agent within the KGB ranks, but even to her, MI6 did not reveal his true name. To Thatcher, he was known by the pseudonym Mr. Collins. In 1984, a young member of the Politburo, Mikhail Gorbachev, visited the country. Thatcher wanted to improve relations with the Soviet Union. MI6 actively used Gordievsky for preparing Gorbachev's visit. On one hand, he provided the British with important information about the questions and problems the Soviet side would raise. Meanwhile, the British conveyed information from Thatcher through Gordievsky. This was, of course, done secretly and presented as good intelligence work by Gordievsky's colleague. As a result, the visit was very successful. This was one of the reasons why in 1985, KGB leaders decided to appoint Oleg Gordievsky as the head of the residency in the United Kingdom. Up until that point, MI6 had been diligently helping their agent advance up the career ladder. They constantly shared useful information with Gordievsky, to one which, on the one hand, did not harm the country's security, but at the same time demonstrated his value to the KGB. Additionally, the British removed obstacles in the form of Gordievsky's bosses. Thus, in the year 1984, under the pretext of espionage activities, the head of the residency, Arkady Guk, was declared persona non grata. His position was taken over by his deputy, and Gordievsky was first promoted to chief of the Political Intelligence Department, and a year later he was made the head of the residency. For MI6, this was an enormous success. Potentially, Gordievsky, in the position of resident, could gain access to very important secrets. And importantly, these were the future prospects of the agent. Who knows, perhaps in the future, the MI6 spy would become the head of the KGB. What neither Gordievsky nor MI6 knew at the time was that 2 weeks before the new resident took office, the KGB acquired its very valuable agent. Aldrich Ames was not the most successful employee of the CIA. In the mid-80s, he held a relatively good position in the Soviet Department of the US Intelligence Service. However, the position did not entail high pay, and Ames' young wife loved the good life. Thus the man accumulated enormous debts, and he urgently needed money. He decided to sell secret information to those who might be most interested in it, the Soviet authorities. MI6 shared Gordievsky's materials with friendly Western intelligence services, including the CIA, but the British did not disclose the source's identity. For the Americans, this was a problem because reporting important data about the Soviet nuclear program to President Reagan without specifying the source was somewhat awkward and unprofessional. As a result, the CIA conducted its own investigation. They used the information supplied by MI6, and by the method of exclusion determined that the source was a KGB officer in London, Oleg Gordievsky. Aldrich Ames worked in the CIA department that was handling this investigation. In one of his initial meetings with representatives of the USSR, he reported that MI6 had a valuable agent who held a high position in the KGB. Ames did not yet disclose his name. But this information was already sufficient for one of the most intensive operations to search for a traitor in the history of the KGB to begin. The day after Aldrich Ames's meeting with the KGB, Oleg Gordievsky received a telegram. He was urgently summoned to Moscow. The formal pretext was a meeting of the new resident in London with his bosses in the USSR. MI6 faced a difficult choice. It was possible that the KGB had uncovered Gordievsky, and his summons to Moscow was merely a pretext for arrest. In that case, he should go nowhere, surrender to the British authorities, and the story of the most valuable agent would end there. However, if it was indeed a regular work call and Gordievsky returned to the position of head of the residency, MI6 would hit the jackpot. Ultimately, the British expressed their concerns to Gordievsky, but the final decision was left to him. He decided to go. Risk, of course, was present, but the potential benefit of a positive outcome was greater. Before heading to the airport, Gordievsky bade farewell to his wife, Layla, and daughters, who still knew nothing about his work for MI6. If the KGB had uncovered him, he would never see his family again. Responsible for capturing the traitor within the KGB ranks was Viktor Budanov. Some called him the most dangerous man in state security. It was he who oversaw the search and installation of listening devices in Gordievsky's house in Moscow. After Oleg Gordievsky discovered the locked door in his apartment, he understood he was being watched. However, if he wasn't apprehended right at the airport, then the KGB hadn't completed their investigation yet. The next day, he went to a meeting with one of the KGB heads, Viktor Grushko. Viktor Budanov was present at this meeting as well. The only source recounting what happened that day in Grushko's office was Gordievsky himself. According to him, at first everything seemed like an official meeting. Then he realized that something was mixed into his cognac, causing Gordievsky to not fully control the situation. Then his colleagues initiated a real interrogation. They said they knew he was a British spy. They were extracting confessions and details from him. Gordievsky did what he was taught at the KGB school in case of such situations. He denied everything. The colonel awoke the next day in an unfamiliar bed. Then he was taken home. The KGB informed him that he was not going to London, was demoted, and had no access to current operations. Gordievsky tried to understand why he hadn't been arrested yet if the KGB knew about his ties with MI6. The only logical answer was that the KGB still didn't have substantive evidence and were trying to find it. Meanwhile, in London, a Soviet embassy employee came to the Gordievsky family's home. He told Layla to pack for Moscow. Allegedly, her husband had taken ill and they needed to fly out urgently. All of this was observed by MI6 personnel. They understood that the urgent family flight to Moscow was likely due to Gordievsky's arrest. It was decided to be fully prepared for Operation Pimlico. Oleg Gordievsky knew he didn't have much time. The KGB would soon find the necessary evidence of his cooperation with MI6. Therefore, it was time to make a decision. After his family returned to Moscow, he explained to them that he had enemies in the KGB trying to accuse him of something he hadn't done. Operation Pimlico was initially intended to involve the escape of the entire family, 2 adults and 2 children. Gordievsky needed either to tell Layla about the planned escape and get her agreement or to flee alone. Gordievsky tried to hint to his wife and ask her about the potential for escape. Based on her reaction, he concluded that he could not trust her, and he made the difficult decision to flee alone. Since the operation was brought to full readiness, a British embassy staff member passed by that very bakery on Kutuzovsky Prospect every day at 7:30 p.m, waiting for the person with a bag marked with the letter S. Finally, on one of those days, while passing by with a chocolate bar in hand, he noticed that very man. They stared at each other for a few seconds. At that moment, the operation to extract Gordievsky from the USSR officially commenced. Oleg went home, moistened the pages of the Shakespeare book, and began to study the details of the impending escape. On Friday, the 19th of July 1985, Gordievsky put on a tracksuit and left his apartment. He knew he was being watched by the KGB, so he pretended to go for a jog. During the process, he evaded surveillance, ran into the metro and reached the station, where he boarded an overnight train to Leningrad. Early in the morning, on the 20th of July, he arrived in Leningrad. From there, he took the commuter train to Zelenogorsk and then boarded a bus heading to Vyborg. He got off in the wilderness at a stop called 836th Kilometre. There he was met by cars with British diplomats. They themselves barely managed to evade KGB surveillance, but the most difficult part was still ahead, the border crossing. The diplomats arrived in 2 cars, as they expected the entire family to escape. Gordievsky was completely undressed and treated with a special solution meant to repel dogs at the border. The British had thoroughly prepared for the escape. They even took along a small child of one of the embassy staff to potentially distract the border guards. Eventually, they were stopped for a document check at the Soviet border checkpoint before the Finnish border. A staff member with a dog was walking nearby. After a few minutes of agonizing waiting, the car was allowed through. Had the Soviet border guards looked in the trunk, they would have found a curled-up and nearly naked Oleg Gordievsky. A few days before Gordievsky's escape, Aldrich Ames had betrayed the names of 24 spies within the KGB ranks, one of them being Oleg Gordievsky. To this day, it is not entirely clear why he was not immediately arrested at that time. Perhaps Budanov and his subordinates were not in a hurry. They were looking for serious evidence of the officer's guilt. The KGB believed that Gordievsky had no chance of escaping the country under constant surveillance. After his disappearance, the Soviet Special Services searched for their former employee's body for a long time. They believed he had committed suicide. Later, when they realized it was an escape, the KGB tried to downplay the level of Gordievsky's access to classified information as much as possible, suggesting he was not an important employee and could not tell Western intelligence anything substantial. However, the fact that even 30 years later, many eyewitnesses from within the KGB refused to discuss the details of what happened speaks volumes. Despite all the diplomatic efforts of the British authorities, Layla Aliyeva and her daughters were only allowed to leave for Britain to join their husband and father 5 years later. Attempts by the spouses to restart their family life were unsuccessful. 2 years later, they finally separated. Their daughters remained in Britain, and Layla continues to live between two countries. 86-year-old Oleg Gordievsky still lives in the United Kingdom under an assumed name in a guarded house.